Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to World at War Comics. My next guest is Mr. Gary Moloney. He is the co-founder of Limit Break Comics Collective, and he is also the writer and creator of When the Blood Has Dried, coming very soon to Mad Cave Studios. Gary, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Tommy.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun, my friend. I appreciate you sending over a early copy of When the Blood Has Dried. I really enjoyed it. Man, maybe we could talk about that. But before we do, maybe we could talk a little bit about your history of how you got into comics, Gary. Did you grow up a big comic fan, and did you know that this is what you wanted to get into at an early age?
Yeah, so I definitely grew up reading comics and reading it widely in general. I was a bit like one of those kids that was always had their head in a book, whether it was the latest fantasy novel that they liked, later on spy stuff. But like comics were always there.
Yeah.
Like it's a bit different in Ireland because while we do have, the traditional comic shop set up, those are much rarer than say news agents. So a lot of times if you're going in for your groceries, if you're going in to get the newspaper, there would at least back in the day be comics on those places as well. And they'd be things like 2000 AD, so the thing that Judge Dredd comes from, uh, kids comics like the Beano and the Dandy, which are kind of very much humor, gag strip style things. But another thing that you would have seen there is they did Marvel reprints for years and years and years. So there was obviously a big history of Marvel UK, and over in Ireland we got those too. But one of the kind of main things that they did, at least in the year when I was growing up, is they had these reprint collections where every month, you would have Astonishing Spider-Man, and Astonishing Spider-Man would reprint 3 issues of US material. So you like people joke about the Clone Saga taking for ages. It probably was a bit quicker over here because we were getting it as 3 issues at a time. But there was also you'd get 3 issues, and sometimes it might be 2 newer issues and then like a classic issue at the back. So they did that for Spider-Man. There was a Daredevil run that came out as well at the same time that the 2003 movie. Wolverine had one called Wolverine and Deadpool that I was pretty a big fan of, which is why the movie title is so funny. Because but you had that, and that was really where I think a lot of Irish creators would have been exposed to the Marvel stuff first by these collections. And Ultimate Spider-Man eventually came out in that format too. So that was my kind of first exposure to kind of proper US comics, and they would have been a big push for that, particularly in the early 2000s. So as the Spider-Man movie comes out, as the X-Men movie is starting to pick up speed, and as it moves on from that, they were there throughout the 90s and before that. But I think there was a big push in the early 2000s that perhaps wasn't there as much before that, or at least I wouldn't have been aware of it to the same extent. So I kind of started getting into US comics through that. Another kind of story that you hear a lot from Irish creators is that, particularly from the generation previous to me, or people who are slightly older, is that they would have grown up reading the Transformers Marvel UK comic, and that was a big thing because it had its own unique stories. My kind of version of that was like I grew up reading a thing called Sonic the Comic, which was a UK, again UK based, which was its own Sonic continuity. So it was separate from the Archie stuff, separate from it was really its own thing, and it was very much kind of a microcosm of the kind of things you'd see in 2000 AD. So it was all dystopian and really kind of about this group that was rebelling against Robotnik and stuff. And I really really enjoyed that. I think that was one of the kind of really ones where I started looking at it going, oh, comics as a medium itself, and not just I like Spider-Man, I like Batman because I've seen the cartoons and stuff. It's like no, comics as themselves are an interesting thing. So over the years, that's where it kind of all began in terms of like liking comics and stuff. And then manga came, and I read all the things that you're supposed to read, and then the things you're not supposed to read as well. And that really kind of got my kind of footing in comics as a medium, something I liked. Uh, and then, like I think, as that often happens too with people who are reading a lot as kids and reading a lot growing up, you're writing as well in the background. So any opportunity I had to do a short story, prose or whatever it was, I would be doing that. Particularly like if you were in class and you've told, oh, you can write an essay, or you can write a short story. I would always go for the short story. I'd be trying my hand at making my own comics and drawing them, even though I was useless at drawing. I had like I remember it's probably still at home somewhere, like a notebook full of a superhero character I made up, and I had like 3 issues in inverted commas
That's awesome.
inside there, and I was building upon it the whole time. So I've always been writing in some sense, and but I think a lot of it in my early days was all focused on prose because there wasn't a lot of opportunities to really, or really like I think it took me a while to realize, oh, comics is something that people write and don't necessarily draw either. I think I always kind of conflated it being like, oh, the person who writes it must be the person who draws it. And be honest with yourself, Gary, you're not going to be drawing these things. Uh, but I actually had a really cool opportunity that happened when I was 15 or 16, where the local county library established a graphic novel project. And it was the first year they were doing it, where they got a professional writer and a professional artist to come in. And there was an application process, but it invited young writers from the city to come in and effectively put together their own comic. So the writers would go off for workshops with the professional writer, look and see what a script looked like.
That's
You
awesome.
know, how to break it down, how to break it down to panels. And then the artists would do the same with their with their mentor. And the idea is that you'd be paired up then and you'd all put together a comic. So I did my kind of first comic, if you want to say in that sense, in like 2008. Uh, Thankfully, I think it's not a great comic. It's not even a good comic. And I think that thankfully most of them can only be found in that one library. But it was very instructive in terms of, okay, well, now I know at the age 16 what this looks like. Because I think it's because at that point, there wasn't as many resources like that around too to see, well, what does a script look like? Or how do you break it down by panel? What are the considerations there? Uh, and then really where it kind of got serious for making comics was when I went to college. I started writing a lot for various like comics websites, doing reviews, doing opinion pieces, with the idea being that okay, this is another way to learn how to make comics. Again, I was still writing, but it was mainly prose. But like, okay, well, if I'm doing reviews or I'm doing op-eds, I really have to look at the craft of this and figure out what works and what doesn't. So I was kind of using that almost as a kind of training ground to figure out, well, what do I like in comics? What don't I like in comics? Picking it apart, how does it work? But it was always with the aim that I want to make comics eventually. And when I moved from my home town of Cork to Dublin, there was a really vibrant Cork comic creating community at the time. There still is, but I wasn't as clued into it. But I also, even though to the extent I was clued in, I didn't have the money to hire an artist, and I was very much aware of the idea that I was a writer who nobody knew, and it's not good to be asking people to work for free. And I wanted to be able to pay people what they were worth. So I moved to Dublin when I got my first job, really. And through that job, I was able to save a bit of money. And I went to a small press day event, which is something that they run in Ireland and the UK, where each year is kind of a celebration of the small press. And I attended that, and I really kind of was introduced to the Dublin comic creating community. And I was like, and through that, that's where I met Paul and Garrett, who co-founded Limb Break Comics with me. And we went for pints afterwards, and we were like, we could do something. We could like focus on, making our own comics and stuff like that. And so it kind of became a way to kind of hold each other to account as well, and kind of encourage each other to push our craft. Paul and I are being writers, and Garrett primarily being an artist, but someone who writes as well. Like, and we kind of push each other to produce things. So after that, I kind of gave myself a challenge where for a year I said, I'll do a short story every month. I'll do a 4-page short story in the vein of a Future Shock. So 4 pages, beginning, middle, and end. Try to work a twist in there. And I have enough money set aside. I can hire artists, I can hire letterers, and I can put them online and get them out there.
Yeah.
And so even if the story ends up being rubbish, then at least I have something to show people, and I'm learning the entire time because I'm doing it. And if I'm failing faster.
Yeah.
And so that's how I kind of started. And ultimately, at the end of that year, I had a collection of short stories, which became the first self-published thing I ever did, called Mixtape. Which is where I in fact met Daniel, my collaborator on When the Blood Is Dried. But in the background as well, during that year, I did the Irish Writer Centre had done 2 kind of comic creating courses. One was by PJ Holden, who artist works 2000D, and the other was by Declan Shalvey. So again, I was honing my craft with them at the same time. So each short story was getting better. At least I think so. Yeah. And so that's where Limb Break Comics came about, really. It was through that process.
Oh, wow. Now, going back to when you were 15 and you published your first comic book through the library, was that of the superhero that you had created before, or is that something completely different?
No, it was something completely different.
Okay,
It was
I was just curious if you used your own superhero in that story.
No, I think there was like a theme to the anthology. So the
Oh,
theme was like it was kind of supernatural themed anthology where all of them kind of had to be linked by a common phrase or something. I can't remember exactly,
yeah, yeah.
but I can't remember what the common phrase was. But it was about it was kind of a vampire style story that I wrote at the time.
Nice.
Uh, as was the popular thing to do back in 2008 was you wrote
Yeah,
your vampire story and
exactly.
then the
Making
million
a
they
comeback,
would
Gary. It's making a comeback, right?
they would park the garbage truck full of money outside your house and then
I
pour it. But
love
actually,
it.
that didn't happen to us, at least not yet. But
Yeah.
maybe someday.
Maybe someday. Yeah. Well, it seems like at a very young age, at least storytelling was something that you were very passionate about. Was there someone in your life outside of the library, or was it the library that really kind of triggered this passion of storytelling?
I mean, in terms of like storytelling, I think like it's a bit of a cliche, but like we kind of Irish we're very good storytellers, right?
Yeah.
So go like we're kind of a nation of storytellers, and we like telling stories. We like telling lies even more. Uh, and sometimes there's the difference
That's
between the
perfect for
two.
comic books. That's perfect.
Sometimes the difference between the two is very, very slight. But like say like there'd be a strong storytelling community, like and
Yeah.
community in my family, like oral storytelling is a big thing in Ireland. So like my grannies would tell me stories the entire time when I was growing up, and they tell you stories based on Irish folklore, things they made up themselves on the fly. And you'd ask the next thing, oh, Granny, could you tell us that story with the horse? You're like, what story with the horse? The one you told us 2 nights ago. It's like, oh, I've forgotten what that was. Because she's just been completely making up on the fly. But like my parents always were always encouraging reading. They're always very, very good at like, you know, encouraging me with that kind of storytelling side of things and encouraging me to read. You know, my mother reads more books than I do every single year. And they're not books I necessarily would read, but she flies through them. Like, and if you're growing up around that, that has an impact too. That kind of has the influence, and particularly if again with your wider family, there's this kind of strong interest in storytelling, interest in song and stuff, which again are kind of closely linked in kind of Irish traditional ideas. Uh, like we say, like if you were speaking in Irish, you don't talk about singing a song, you talk about saying a song as if it's a story.
Yeah.
Uh, and so that was always present in my life. So I think that kind of crept into me one way or another.
That's awesome, man. I love it though. I love it. I love it. So let's get back to Limit Break Comics. So you
Yeah,
have the mixtape is your first kind of written work under Limit Break. It was three of you that came together to create that, and all of you brought your own stories into that publishing.
yeah. So Limit Break is myself. At least at the start, it was myself, Paul Carroll, and Garrett Luby.
Mhm.
We've since been joined by a fourth permanent member, a guy called Seamus Kavanagh. Uh, but the idea was that Limit Break became kind of as I said, kind of an accountability mechanism. So I was putting together my collection of shorts, and the idea was always practice the craft, get the 4 pages done, and then publish it and have something that you can hand to an editor, as a portfolio piece. Uh, a lot of times when you see people, giving advice to creators, they're like, okay, start small, start with your short stories, right? And that's what I did. But there's also the other reason was that I think 2000 AD did in Thought Bubble, which is a convention over the UK, did a pitch fest, and 2000 AD also had open submissions for short stories, for 4 page short stories. So the idea was, yes, I'm learning my craft, but then also I'm learning my craft with the view to I have an avenue where I wanted to go. Uh, and even though that didn't ultimately work out, I still think it's a good idea. And like any of my other friends who talk about people who want to go into comics, like start small, do short stories, expand out to a one shot, go from there. But the idea was that I would do mixtape, Paul would do his own book, and then Paul and Garrett also have their own character, a character called Frankie in a book called Meouch, who is this. The way I describe him is like, what if you mixed Deadpool with Garfield, right? So
Nice.
it's this assassin cat. So, but that was their character, and they
That's
had been
awesome.
working on a kind of and they're running. They have a series of that's going on at the moment, but they wanted to work on that. There wasn't any idea to kind of publish any stories outside of our own. It was really just to work with people we liked working with. So, like, I worked with several different artists on mixtape. Some of them were Irish, some of them weren't. Uh, and it was the idea we'd work with the people we wanted to work with, and then we just we'd help each other out. We'd go to our conventions, we'd have our stand, if there was a convention I could go to that the others couldn't, I'd bring their books along and vice versa. And the rising tide would raise all the boats. And we started with our own kind of, self-curated, self-edited anthologies. And then we kind of expanded out from there so that we're on a yearly basis now, we run a big open call for our myth-based anthologies. So we had three kind of ones that are based on like, old, established mythology. So we had one, Turning Roads was Irish folklore. Down Below was Greek mythology as noir crime stories.
Nice.
And then Fractured Realms was Norse mythology as horror stories. The idea was always one of the classic mythologies mixed with a genre and a genre take on those stories.
Yeah.
And just last night, as we're recording, Paul and I, who we co-edit those anthologies, finished up selecting the stories for our next anthology to come out, which is Wish Upon a Star. And that will be mixing classic fairy tales with sci-fi approaches. So reinterpreting those tales both thematically and otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the meat of a lot of what Limit Break does now, where we'll have our annual open call, we'll run crowdfunding for it, but we also make sure that everyone gets paid as part of that. Yeah. And we've been lucky enough that we've gotten Arts Council supporting in Ireland for that on occasion, which allows us to pay people decent rates for those books.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, is the fan base mainly just Ireland, or do you see a lot of people like in the UK, Scotland, Wales? Is it like all of Europe right there that you're selling your comics to?
I mean, when it comes to the conventions, we're mainly between ourselves. It's in the Irish-based cons and the UK, and sometimes further afield. But we haven't really had an opportunity to go much further afield because we set up Limit Break in 2018. We were expanding in 2019, and then COVID hit.
Yeah.
So we couldn't even go anywhere if we wanted to.
Yeah, COVID messed up a lot of things, right?
COVID messed up so many things. But one of the things that the Kickstarter allows us to do is that the Kickstarters for the anthologies, where the kind of the bulk of our sales are for those anthologies, like those are international. We have people from the US who are getting it, and like lots of people from all over the world who are looking for it. Shipping has increased and made it more difficult, and we often get questions like, "Why is this shipping so expensive?" It's like, I don't know, man. Tell the economy.
Yeah.
Like, so we always try to provide as well like a very affordable digital copy as part of our campaigns, so that we can cater to people in the US or in Australia and stuff who might not want to pay the extra it takes. But those have been good in that, obviously we sell the particular anthology that we're looking for, but also our back catalogue tends to get picked up a lot. So particularly if someone's ordering from the US, they just go, all right, I'm going to pick the everything you guys have done tier. And so we then break our backs lugging these down to the post office. Like say for Turning Road, which is the first one we did, we had 500 backers for that.
Wow.
800 for down Below, which was insane. And then roughly 500 again for Fractured Realms, 400 or 500 Fractured Realms. So it's changed, but like we get a good amount of backings, and say a lot of those would be from overseas, alongside obviously the people in the UK and Irish comic scenes who know who we are because we're showing up at things and are following those anthologies too.
I mean, that's pretty impressive to get anything over a couple hundred. That's pretty awesome. So congratulations. That's huge. That's huge.
Oh, thanks, man. Like I think it's always helpful when you have an anthology that's like, because these are like 100-page anthologies each time. So you have like every individual person is bringing their people, their fans and their friends and family to the table. So that helps obviously. But like I think we've put together good anthologies over the years, and we've leveled up, since we began with these 25-page, 24-page, 30-page floppies to big, thick, proper spined anthologies that, like, at least as far as I'm concerned, I'm happy to go on a bookshelf next to anything else that would be in comic shops in the US or elsewhere.
Yeah. In the US, the floppy world is a big part of comic books. At least it has been historically, right? So every Wednesday I'm at my comic book store picking up, whatever's in my pull box for that week. But my understanding outside of Canada and the US, it's more of a trade back kind of business, right? Where people do want a longer story at one time. And so it makes a lot of sense. And we're starting to see that transition in the US. people are going from, every single Wednesday picking up their book, waiting for, those 4, 5, 6 issues to be put into a trade, and then just getting the trade so they could read a longer story at one time. So we're starting to see that transition where the US is now following the rest of the world into that kind of that trade paperback world, which I enjoy, right? I still like my Wednesday pull list, and it might just because I'm old and I've just been doing it for a long time. But I do like to sit down for an hour and be able to read through something a little bit longer. So I think that trend is catching on in the US, and might be why you're getting so many US backers too. I think people want great stories, but they also want a little bit of meat with what they're purchasing, right? As opposed to, 24 pages, and then you have this cliffhanger and you got to wait a whole month for the next part of the story. And by the time you get the comic, at least the older I get, I seem to forget what I read. So I have to go back and read why it was a cliffhanger to get to that next. I don't know if you are noticing that as well, but at least that's how I'm seeing the US market.
No, definitely. Like, I mean, floppies are a big thing over here too, in that
Okay.
sense. Like, we do have like as I say, we do have the traditional style comic shops that have the floppies. Have the Wednesday Warriors. I'm in my local comic shop. I'm picking my stuff up every week, or at least I try to every week. And like I enjoy that too.
Yeah.
I think in terms of small press, particularly, it's becoming less and less viable to do a single floppy. And to realistically, make any sort of profit on it, or to like, the cost of paper, the cost of getting it printed is just too much. So it makes more economic sense to do kind of larger collections. But also, all of our short story collections like that, they're each short story. So there'd be like 20 or 25 short stories. They're all 4 pages. They're all self-contained, and so we try to kind of like I think one of the things I like in comics is I think I like short stories. I think there's a skill to doing a really kind of succinct, gets in, says what it has to say, and gets out in 4 pages, or maybe sometimes over 4 pages. And that's certainly something that is probably more prevalent or more common on this side of the ocean than over in the US. But I think you're starting to see a lot of the other companies like recognize the value of the short story format too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I know there is I think there is a changing marketplace between floppies and trades. People liking to trade rate more. So I think like companies that are able to be flexible about that, or offer different avenues for doing that, are going to do well. But I think the floppy is always going to be there, and I think it's very. But I think it's reassuring to see as well that you see a lot of series that might have done reasonably okay in single issues, but then really have their moment in trade. And I think you're seeing that more and more in the US, which I think can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. I love it. I love it. And I'm starting to see I transition that way a little bit as well. Just because I want to be able to have that longer story that I could sit down and capture it all and be able to digest it and enjoy it. But yeah, that's awesome, Gary. So Gary, you have this new comic going through Mad Cave. How did this happen, right? How did you go from publishing short stories through your own publishing to going through Mad Cave with more of a traditional style of a comic book? How did that happen?
So I think that was the short answer is open submissions.
Yeah.
That there was Mad Cave are one of the few US companies that do a very comprehensive and open submissions policy. So that if you are putting together a pitch, if you're putting together an idea for a book, you have somewhere to send it. Image do it, Dark Horse do it, Mad Cave do it as well. But one of where it kind of came from is that, so as I said, when I was doing Mixtape, one of my first collaborators that I ever worked on comics with was Daniel Romero, who's my co-creator and the artist on When the Blood Has Dried. And we clicked straight away. We realized that we kind of liked the same things. We had similar storytelling sensibilities, and he's just a lovely dude, very easy to work with, very pleasant.
That's important, right? That's important.
It's very important. Like, people underestimate this. You have to be able to live with people and talk with them. So like, but we got on like a house on fire, and we knew that if we wanted to do something longer, if we were going to try to pitch series, because I also knew like that Daniel had the storytelling chops from day one, right? He's obviously gotten way better since 2018 when I first worked with him, right? He's like, you just come on leaps and bounds every single year. And even between like the pitch pages for When the Blood Has Dried to the final book, he's just leveled up so much. But we always knew we wanted to work together on something longer. The question was like, okay, well, we need to find the right story first. And I have to be able to put aside enough to be able to like, Daniel needs seats at the end of the day. So I have to be able to make sure that I can support Daniel for that.
Yeah.
And so I think it was around, and one of the things I had done when I moved from Cork to Dublin as well is that I started playing D&D. I hadn't ever played tabletop RPGs before that. I played a lot of video game RPGs that would be inspired by it, like Knights of the Old Republic, things like that. So I had a framework for understanding it, but I never actually done it myself until when I moved up, and a friend of mine who I'd known for a while, and then I was finally able to meet up and more often in Dublin. I was like, hey, listen, I'm running a game. Come on over and give it a go. And sure, there was no harm doing it. And through that, I had kind of a realization, or like, all right, well, one thing I had a reawakening for my love of the more traditional epic fantasy, because I loved fantasy novels growing up. You know, I mean, I grew up when Lord of the Rings became like was massive, but it became super massive because of the movies, right? So there were the video games. Games Workshop had its own board game that I played relentlessly. You know, there was a couple of Christmases there where that was what I'd get. I'd get the new starter set every year for it. So I'd have my Men of Gondor, my Riders of Rohan and stuff.
That's awesome.
And all of that. So like I kind of grew up in that context. And so along with that came, a resurgence of high fantasy novels or in their popularity. And so I was reading things like Joe Abercrombie, Brian Jacks, Philip Pullman, all that kind of stuff I was reading growing up. Then at some point, I don't know what it is or what it was, but I kind of like I got a bit fed up of the kind of traditional high fantasy. I'd tried at times, it's like, oh, I can write a prose novel of my own and do things like that. But it wasn't really working, and I couldn't really understand why. I think I understand now, but for whatever reason, I fell out of love with the genre, right? And I still liked fantasy, so I was reading kind of urban fantasy style things like the Dresden Files and the likes of that. They kind of kept me having a foot in that, and I kind of liked that style. But and it also kind of like leads into why I did, and I think that's why I ended up doing a lot of crime stories when I first started writing comics as well, because I had the kind of urban fantasy background where many of them are pitched as kind of noir takes on fantasy ideas. But ultimately, like I kind of fell out of love, and then having, obviously Game of Thrones came along and that became huge. But then really playing D&D, I was like, actually, no, I really, really like high fantasy as a setting. But also in playing D&D and as playing as these kind of, adventurers, it got me thinking about, okay, well, like there's the gloss that's over the D&D party in that, you're all having fun with your friends, you're the protagonists of your own stories, and you can be as vicious as you want or as friendly as you want, but it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, most people in the game are probably going to love you anyway. And that's all very well and good until you take a step back and have a think about it a bit more. Right? Say, all right, well, what did my party actually do this week? It's like, okay, well, we came to this village, we rocked up, we stole a bunch of stuff, we overthrew the local government for no reason other than we wanted to, or that someone was going to pay us money to do it. And then we killed the bad guy, rode off into the sunset, and and the villagers will live in peace forever. And I'm sure nothing bad will ever happen there again.
Yeah.
Now that's obviously being a bit facetious, but that's the kind of things that you would come across, and you see it a lot in, like, say, like World of Warcraft or things like that, or like there's been many jokes made about Zelda, about Link going into these places and just robbing people blind and killing all their chickens and stuff. But the idea was, like, I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, like, I know we keep calling ourselves adventurers, but you're sellswords, and like, what is a sellsword? A sellsword is a mercenary, right? And mercenaries tend not to be the nicest people.
Not really.
Like they're the mere fact that you're selling your sword, that is like, that you're not fighting for a purpose, you're not fighting for a cause per se, whether just or otherwise, you're fighting for yourself. And it kind of hit me as well. I was like, okay, well, a lot of Western stories are like that too. They're about the old gunslinger who has lived this life, and they might have been a bank robber, or they might have been a cattle herder, things like that. And there may have been glory and all this fun when they were younger, but really as they get on, they kind of look back on it all with regret. They start to feel the weight of everything. Like, it's there in Cowboy Bebop too, where like a lot of the characters there, they've lived their lives and they're now grappling with those choices that they've made, and choices that they're not necessarily happy with, but they have to live with them because they can't change them. And the only thing they can do is start to try to live a better life, whatever that might look like. And I was like, it'd be really cool if you looked at the traditional heroic fantasy that way. And if you took, say, the classic adventurer and made them the retired gunslinger and see how that works. Now, that's not, a unique concept that I came up with, but it's true. Like there's been other novelists in the high fantasy world who've looked at that, or epic fantasy, who've examined that and looked at that. But through D&D, it really kind of solidified it for me. And then it also happened at the same time that that Daniel had started to work on illustrating RPGs himself too. Like that he'd be hired for commissions to do up people's parties, or he'd work on source books that people were putting together. And so I messaged Daniel and be like, I think I have an idea. And so that's when the idea of When the Blood Has Dried came from. It came from that exploration of that like kind of rediscovery of the high fantasy genre, but also figuring out, well, what if I wrote it as if it was a crime story? Like, what if I wrote it as this kind of grounded take on fantasy, not trying to be, like deconstructivist or anything like that, or trying to be additive, but like looking at it from this different point of view. So we kind of came up with that idea. We kind of cemented the idea that if we're going to be doing something, it's going to be this. During the pandemic, I was very, very lucky that there was a couple of opportunities that arose during the pandemic for, say, people to look at your scripts. There was like professional writers said, oh, if you contributed X amount to this charity, I'll give you a script review. And so one of those people was Mark Sable. And so Mark Sable, who has done work for pretty much all the companies and is a really, really talented writer, put out that offer, and I took him up on it. And that meant that, okay, well, now I actually have to write the story. Right. So I wrote the first issue for the purpose of getting notes back. And he gave very, very positive feedback on it. He's like, I think you should try to pursue this and get it done. So Daniel and I chatted. We talked about how we'd put it together. And we put together the first 5 pages that you see in the book, in the final book that we sent on to you, those are the pitch pages that we put together in 2021. So, and they were kind of designed with the idea this is going to be our showcase for how we're going to present the book. So we put those together. It took a while. And it took a while because for various reasons. But eventually we got into a point in 2022 where we'd gotten it put together, we gotten it lettered, and we were ready to start chopping it around. And as luck would have it, Mad Cave opened up their submissions at roughly the same time that we were ready, in terms of we had enough material that we were confident that this is like one, that the pitch document that I was going to be putting in was the best it could be. Yeah. The pages were ready, and we ourselves were ready, so that we could do it if we wanted to. So I submitted it to the slush pile in Mad Cave, and a couple of weeks later I heard back from them. So it was like a lot of times I think when people are looking at breaking into comics, or when you hear people give advice, people say, oh, you do your, like I said earlier, you do your short stories and then you do your one shot. And I think a lot of time, particularly, and it might be more in the US, but the idea is that, oh, well, if you do that, then you might get noticed. But I think the important thing that people don't think about as well is that you do that so that your craft is ready. Yeah. So that if the opportunity does come knocking, that you're ready for it. Because at the point at which that I submitted the pitch to Mad Cave, like, Mad Cave didn't know me from Adam. None of the editors there had heard of me before. I just happened to put into a pitch that was picked up. And it was picked up from the slush pile, and it could have easily not have been picked up in the same way. So I was very, very lucky in that sense, but also I think it's a testament to Mad Cave that they're a place that is willing to invest and look at new talent. And not, obviously they've got the talent search program, which is like so cool, like such a good opportunity that like very few companies offer. Yeah. But also they're willing to take that chance on newer creators putting in their own work. If you've done the work beforehand, if you're ready to go, there is opportunities there for you. So I think that's a testament to Mad Cave as a company, who've been like, and as an editorial and a publishing team, who've just been like wonderful collaborators throughout this process. But yeah, that's the long story of how it got to Mad Cave.
That's awesome, man. So as far as the story goes, right? So we have issue 1 that I believe will be out in April timeframe.
Yeah, 10th of April.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then how many issues have you and David worked on leading up to this? Or Daniel, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we have 3 issues in the can, right? So at the
Okay.
moment, 3 issues are finalized. The fourth issue is going to be finished quite soon, right? So by the time issue 1 comes out, the
Yeah.
majority of the book will be ready to go.
Very good.
Because we've been working on this for the last year.
Yeah.
So we've been working on this since January of 2023. That's when we started, pencils up, let's go.
Yeah.
Pencils down the paper, start, working on it. We've been working on it consistently since then.
Yeah.
And again, testament to Mad Cave, giving it the time it needed,
Yeah.
giving Daniel the opportunity to do his thing, because Daniel is not only doing the line work, but he's coloring it as well.
Oh wow.
And the results speak for themselves, I think, in a lot of that.
Yeah.
And Daniel is a traditional artist as well. He doesn't do a lot of stuff. The inking stuff is all done on paper. Coloring is done digitally, but so he puts a lot of effort and a lot of work into it. And Mad Cave were very open and willing to give him the time he needed to make the book the best possible version of itself it could be. But we've been working on it for the last year in various different stages. And when it was announced last month, I was just finally glad to be able to talk about it and to not have to talk around it on Twitter, going like, "Oh, I'm working on something really fun today," with an old collaborator who you may or may not hear about soon. I was glad to be able to finally talk about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah,
I'm
but
glad too, and I feel very honored that I was able to take a look at that first issue because Daniel does do an amazing job throughout that entire issue. I mean, the artwork is spectacular, even the background. So obviously, the world and the setting that the story takes place. There's a lot of things happening behind the scenes too on each of the panels. The amount of detail that goes into that is just crazy. I mean, there's a scene where um Meabh is walking through the town buying like fruit, and you could just see the background. I love that kind of stuff, the detail. I mean, incredible, incredible. I cannot wait for people to get this into their hands. And what a perfect time for your story to come out with Mad Cave celebrating 10 years, their 10-year anniversary. I just think this is perfect for you and Daniel to get your story out there because they're making a lot of noise with their 10th year anniversary. And talking to Mark, all these other cool things that they're doing to really help that Mad Cave label, be what it really should be, right? Is one of the top publishers around the world. And man, what a perfect timing for you and Daniel to have your story be picked up by Mad Cave.
No, and it's been really again like such a privilege to work with them as well. But like to be part of that 10-year initiative, it's very humbling in that sense that they put us front and center, and you go into the Mad Cave website and go, oh look, there's my book.
Yeah.
Like in that that can't be understated how cool that is.
Oh yeah, for sure.
After a long time working on small press stuff. But no, Daniel's work on the book has been fantastic, and each issue just gets better and better. Like the coloring just adds so much to it. Like there's that vibrancy you say, like that the town comes alive, and like that's an important thing for the book, because when you're looking at a book that's about a retired adventurer gunslinger something who's looking back on that life of violence, and like the main kind of core of the book is about uh, the guild that Meabh tries to escape from, the prospect of that returning into her life, and what that means, and if that's going to cause her to lose this bit of peace that she's managed to build for herself. And that only works if you believe that the town is something worth protecting.
Yeah.
Either the people of the town, but also just the soul of the town more generally. And so you can understand why Meabh would want to hold on to that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's what Daniel does brilliantly in those kind of early pages set in Carraig and Bhun is really kind of sell you on the town as a character of itself.
Yeah, yeah. No doubt. I mean, right, because she's what you called a blow-in. So she's not really born and raised within that town, but because of her background and because of her experience of now being in that town and being accepted, she has a unique, I think, view of how important it is to maintain what that town has, as opposed to someone who maybe grew up there and hasn't experienced some of the things that Meabh has experienced, right? So her unique ability to see the town for what it is, and knowing where she came from, and now experiencing this life of peace and being accepted by this town, you could see how important it would be for her to kind of maintain what that town has provided for her, right? And so there is this emotional side to it too, where you're kind of hopeful that there is going to be a positive outcome, because it has been really great for her, right?
Yeah, but like I'm also very glad that you picked up on the concept of a blow-in, because
Yeah.
that's very much an Irish term that you see bandied about a lot. So like one of the things I want to do as well with this book is to kind of bring a kind of a uniquely Irish sense to the high fantasy thing as
Yeah.
well. So like Maeve is described as a blow-in, like that's a term you'd see described a lot to people who have moved. So like I'm originally from a
So
lot of
you're
rural.
blowing in Dublin then?
Well, I'm certainly a blow-in in Dublin, but like
Yeah.
that's applied a lot where I come from a lot of from kind of a rural background, a lot of kind of countryside area. Like that's where my family was from originally, and you'd see a lot of people who were either born abroad or who were city folks who come to the country, and because they weren't born and raised there, as much as they might be accepted by the community, they're always a blow-in. They're never going to be fully. They're part of the community, but there's always the bit of asterisk at the top. They're like,
Can never
sure, don't
shake it,
listen
huh?
to
You can't
don't
shake
listen to him. Sure, he's only a blow-in. Sure, what would he do with the place, right?
it.
Like
Yeah.
that's the kind of idea. And so, but that was you hit on the nail on the head exactly. It what it affords her is that she gets an opportunity to know what being without this town feels like, but also the dangers that can easily be that this town easily faces, and how it could quickly lose what makes it special. Like you see, like so much is written and talked about in terms of you can never go back home, or you like say if you move away from your hometown, right, and you come back and the pubs that you remember drinking in, those are gone. The
Yeah.
restaurants that the local restaurants that were there throughout when you were growing up have been replaced by coffee chains, or they've been replaced by these other more corporate elements, or kind of that where kind of a soul of a place is taken, and it's no longer the place you remember. So Maeve is grappling with that as well, because even if the arrival of the guild, this force that tried to kill her at one point, she was part of it, but she tried to kill her at the end. Because again, like it's very like leaving a criminal gang, you don't do that. You don't. That doesn't end well for anyone. But
Yeah.
so there's the personal threat to her, but also knowing what if you have a big institution like the guild, as we present the guild as being this kind of powerful institution,
Yeah.
if that becomes part of the town, then the character of the town will change.
Yeah.
And so what is a very kind of warm and open place
Yeah.
can change very, very different, particularly against the context in which we see them coming to the town. As you see a bit in issue 1, but you'll explore a bit more in the issues that come on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's the first, I would say, 2 pages, maybe. There's a whole other side of this story that we really haven't been exposed to yet, right? Because it goes from that first scene, and I don't want to try not to give too much away because I want people to get excited about this.
Yeah,
But right, there's that first couple pages, which kind of sets the tone later on in the story, especially when you look back at those first 2 pages, when she finds out the guild might be coming to the town that she's currently at. Then all of a sudden things started clicking. I had to go back to those first 2 pages and reread those. And you're like, man, there's this whole other story that hasn't been told about Maeve in the guild, and how she got out of that situation in the first couple pages and made her way to that town. So I'm hoping that at least we get a little bit of that story as well, Gary, because that sounds as interesting as the rest of the story and where it's going.
yeah, but like that is like I think those pages are out there publicly. They're in those are on previews. Those are on Mad Kid's website. So if you see like preview pages, it's
Okay,
from
perfect.
those first couple of pages.
Excellent. That's
Uh,
right. That's true. Yeah.
but yeah, but
I just want to be
that's
careful that I don't give away your whole
yeah,
story.
no, no, definitely. Like
Yeah.
that's why like I think they're fair game to an extent,
There you go.
particularly for anyone who's listening to this interview. But I think it's important thing there is that there is this kind of parallel story, and it doesn't just stop in issue 1. So one of the framing, or one of the kind of the structural things we do, is that the first 3 pages of each issue are a flashback.
Oh, okay.
So we start with Maeve at the very, very end of that old life as this institution, this guild that she's been a part of, like, and she's trying to escape from, is trying to kill her. And so you start with that kind of cold opening, and as you said, it kind of sets the tone of like, this is what the risk is. This is what is the prospect of arriving in the town, and no one knows it but Maeve.
Yeah.
No one knows the risks involved there and the danger that presents. But as we go on, so each issue has that kind of 3-page opening, cold open, which give you more insight into how Maeve came to accept the town. So it doesn't go, it kind of follows chronologically, where each it's not directly one after another, but each opening 3 pages gives you an insight into Maeve leaving the guild and then coming to accept Carraig and Bhun. So, who rescued her? Why did she decide to stay in the town? What lessons did she learn in those times? Those are things that we hint at and talk about a bit in the opening sections. But like, you're right, there is an entire other story there about Maeve and what happened beforehand. Like, that's why, again, earlier I mentioned Cowboy Bebop as being one of like my kind of like creative touchstones. Because in so much in Cowboy Bebop, and like one of the code names for this when I was in the background was Fantasy Bebop, because that makes one of the things in Cowboy. One of the things you see is that in Cowboy Bebop is this idea that Spike story, Faye's story, Jet story, we come in after their kind of character arcs have finished almost. The Jet's past with the police is only hinted at. Spike's past as a hitman, you get flashes at, but really the story is less interested in telling you about that past, but more so how it frames them and how it informs who they are today and whether they embrace that past or reject it. So that was the kind of one of the creative touches. Like, that was the kind of feel I was going for with that. So the fact is that this could be an epilogue to an adventure that you didn't see.
Yeah.
But it's more about, but in a way, maybe if the book does brilliantly, maybe we'll go back and tell that story, or we'll go back and tell different stories. But like this has always been idea of having it as a contained, limited story that is about how one lives with that life rather than what that life was like itself.
So good. So good, Gary. I can't wait for people to get their hands on this. I really enjoyed issue 1. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, thanks, man.
It was a lot of fun.
It's good to know that someone other than people close to me think
that other than you and Daniel really liked it.
Yeah. It's like, this is really good, Dan, isn't it? It's like, read good, Gary, really good. Best thing you've ever written. Best thing you've ever drawn, mate.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. No, I really enjoyed it, and I cannot wait for issue number 2. April, you said April 6th?
It's April 10th, so final order cutoffs will be a month before that.
Yeah.
So 10th of March, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, anybody listening to this podcast, you got to get into your local comic book store. Ensure that you let them know that when the blood has dried, you want that in your pull box. That way they could pick that up and make sure that they have it every single month, because it's good. Especially if you love these type of stories, man, you're gonna have a blast with this. It's a story within a story, kind of, because there are 2 things going on at one time, which I absolutely love. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that the first 3 pages or so are going to be a little bit of a flashback, because that part of the story, at least to me, I found very interesting as well. And obviously the rest of the story is amazing, and I can't wait to see what happens to the town and everybody that lives in it, because they seem to have been experiencing a lot of peace for a very long time, and I have a feeling that could change a little bit as we get further along into this story. So pretty awesome. Hey, Gary, as far as some of your earlier work when it comes to Limit Break Comics Collective, how do people find that? And if they want to purchase some of your earlier work, how do they do that?
So Limit Break Comics has its own website, so it's limbreakcomics.com. But probably the best thing to do is if you go there, there's a store. You can see all the different catalog of titles we've had. Our own stuff and our own anthologies, other kind of self-contained or ongoing series. But probably one of the best things to do is that Wish Upon a Star will be on Kickstarter in March. And if you follow the campaign page for that is already up, so you can follow it. And particularly if you're in the US and you're looking to get our books, that's probably going to be the most effective way for you to do it, because you'll get the latest book, but you can also add any of our other previous books in it as well. So that's probably the best way to. So look at the website, something that you fancy. You can obviously order it through that, and we'll send it out to you. But following Wish Upon a Star, which is edited by myself and Paul Carroll and features a cover by Nate Stockman and Deacon Huff, along with multiple other creators who we're going to be announcing those teams this week, because we just finalized them last night. But that's probably the best bet to keep an eye on Limit Break Comics. So go on to Twitter, follow Twitter/X/ whatever you want to call it, the blue
Whatever it's
sky,
called now, right?
whatever it's called nowadays. You know, I can't believe it's not Twitter. Uh, any of the social media sites, look for Limit Break Comics, and if you follow us there, you'll be able to see when we launch the campaign page as well as everything we're doing going forward.
Awesome. And then as far as Mad Cave, right, at least in the US, all you have to do is go to your local comic book store and let them know that you want that title in your pull box. That is When the Blood Has Dried, which is awesome. Trust me, you're going to want to pick this up. It's going to be one of those titles for Mad Cave in their 10th anniversary that you're going to want to read for sure. And then as far as following you, Gary, how do people follow you and everything that you're doing? Or should they just kind of focus on Limit Break Comics?
No, you can. I'm on most social media platforms as well. If you type in Gary Moloney or When the Blood Has Dried, I should come up. You know, I think on Twitter or X, I'm M_Garrod, which is difficult to pronounce or difficult to spell for those outside of Ireland. So if you just type in Gary Moloney,
Yeah.
I tend to pop up as the only one who's there talking about comics.
Yeah.
But if you follow the Limit Break account, you'll be. I pop up on that too, so you'll be able to follow me one way or another.
So, Gary, last question. So this title is your newest forte with Mad Cave. Do you have other stories that you're already working on? Obviously, if you do, you probably can't speak to it, but are you looking at other things that you're working on getting published in this same fashion?
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm working on a couple of different things that I want to get off the ground. There's nothing I can talk about yet, but I'm in the middle of putting together additional, different series together and shopping them around with creators, with collaborators I've worked with in the past, and some newer ones too. So yeah, I'm definitely working on what's next, but also focusing on trying to make sure that people know about When the Blood Has Dried. One of the cool things we're going to be doing is that there's going to be some there's going to be some RPG tie-in material that we do as well, that will come out alongside the book. So you'll have kind of that kind of additional things too, a bit like Die, a bit like The Last God from Philip K. Johnson. So there'll be kind of D&D compatible stuff too. So that's a fun little additional thing we're doing alongside it. But really, I'm just focusing on trying to make sure as many people as possible know about the book and give it a shot. But yeah, I have notebooks upon notebooks of ideas, and I've a couple of other notebooks that have a focus. All right, here's what the story is. Here's what the pitch looks like. And so I'm just working with my collaborators at the moment and trying to make those books and those pitches the best they can be, and then hopefully they find a home somewhere nice.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. I'm sure they will. Well, Gary, I can't tell you how much I appreciate connecting with me over on X. I'm so happy to have had you on. I'm hoping that as soon as this thing drops and hits comic book stores, we could have you back on and maybe we could talk a little bit about issue 2, 3, and so on and so forth.
Definitely.
It'd be a lot of fun, man.
No, definitely. Like once a couple of more, once it's out, we can have a chat about that and go from there. Yeah, I'm just definitely happy to come back on. It's been fun. It's been really, really fun.
I'm glad that you enjoyed it, Gary. I've enjoyed it myself, and I've enjoyed getting to know you. And yeah, you're always welcome, my friend.
Thank you so much, Tommy. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you have a wonderful week.
You too.
All right, thank you.